In this lecture, I wish to sketch the Byzantine world in the time of the Emperor Basil II, who ruled from 976 to 1025, often known as Basil the Bulgar Slayer, Bulgar Oktonos in Greek. And the reason for the choice of that reign is that he represents the epitome of what is known as the Middle Byzantine state. In the year 1000, as I mentioned earlier, Constantinople was clearly the greatest Christian state, bar none. And in his reign, many of the institutional, religious, and cultural features of the Byzantine world are articulated, and this is the world in which the Crusaders will come into contact. And I think Basil's reign is a good way of showing how the Byzantine world looked when the Crusaders arrived in 1095. And he's living approximately a generation and a half earlier than the Crusades. He ruled from the city of Constantinople, founded by the Emperor Constantine back in the 4th century AD, which was hailed the New Rome. And through much of Byzantine literature, Constantinople is often referred to as the New Rome. And by the time of the Crusades, for a variety of reasons, the Byzantines were very, very finicky about insisting that they were the New Rome and that the old Rome was really quite inferior. The city was also hailed as the Queen of Cities. Both Byzantine and Western writers both speak of the city that way. Now, Basil II, as all Byzantine emperors, ruled over a powerful bureaucratic state. This state had adopted the use of the Greek language in the 7th century as its administrative language. The emperors were often known as a basileus, a king in ancient Greek. Many of the Roman Latin terms had been translated in Greek or had been replaced by Greek terms, and the empire was largely Greek-speaking. Its core was what is now Asia Minor, Turkey, the Aegean Islands, Greece, the lower Balkans. But the Byzantines also controlled extremely important possessions in southern Italy and had claims in Basil's time to Sicily as well, which was still a majority of Greek speakers. However, Basil's empire had influences that radiated far beyond the political frontiers. The Byzantine missionaries had been successful in converting the South Slavic peoples as well as the Russians. And starting in 989, the Prince of Kiev, Vladimir, embraced the Orthodox faith and was married to the sister of Basil II. So the Byzantine state is often referred to as a Byzantine commonwealth in the time of Basil II, was more than just its immediate political area. Furthermore, this Byzantine emperor was the heir to political and ideological traditions that go all the way back into the late Roman period and even earlier. Byzantine emperors insisted that they were equal to the apostles, iso apostolikos in Greek. They often also maintained they were the new David, and they had a mixture of images coming out of the Old Testament and out of Greek religious themes from the late Roman period, in which the emperor was seen essentially as a partner to the patriarch, that is, the spiritual head of the Orthodox Church. Patriarch and emperor were often seen as working in tandem. They resided in the same capital, that made it all the more easy, and there are occasions where patriarchs and emperors clashed. And in those circumstances, the Byzantines themselves saw that not so much as a struggle between church and state as a schism, a cutting within the single Orthodox community, which hits that theme I mentioned earlier in previous lectures, that the Byzantine world did see a coincidence of spiritual and political authority, that there was a single Orthodox community administered by a Byzantine emperor as well as an Orthodox patriarch. Emperors also elaborated their great ceremonial role. In the course of the 2 centuries before Basil II, you got the impression that a Byzantine emperor never held a normal conversation. At least that's what state occasions seem to indicate. The emperor was glorified and dignified. There is an elaborate set of instruments that were created in the imperial throne room, including a mechanical bird tree powered by steam. There was also something of a barber chair, which was devised by the Emperor Theophilus, where the emperor would receive barbarians, envoys, and he would be seated. The barbarian envoy would bow down and present his petition. The emperor would press a button. The seat went to the second level. There was a quick costume change, and then the emperor was sent down. And when the barbarian looked up, the emperor who had previously been in emeralds was now in rubies, and they were just amazed. How could the emperor do this? Now some of these devices seem rather simple to us, but they were impressive to the peoples of the time. Byzantium also had the Roman architectural traditions, its churches, notably Hagia Sophia, and all of these were employed as diplomatic emblems and weapons for the Byzantine emperor. There was nothing more impressive than to be taken into a full mass in Hagia Sophia. There are reports of certain Russians, especially Queen Olga, converting simply by the fact that God must dwell in this magnificent church. So the Byzantine emperors really did cloak themselves in Orthodox symbols. And one point that I should stress, and this is especially relevant to the time of the Crusades, by the time the Crusades arrived, the classic Byzantine religious art, and I draw that distinction from private art, had triumphed. The images that we associate with Byzantine art were now the norm. Basil II, who was one of the great Macedonian emperors. This was the dynasty that ruled from 867 to 1056, a dynasty that sought legitimacy by upholding the veneration of images, icons, and also donating enormous amount of imperial money to churches, to monasteries, to schools, and really making orthodoxy, the Orthodox tradition we associate with the Eastern Church today, the religion of the dynasty and the religion of victory, as we'll see in another lecture. So that's an important point to stress, that when the Crusaders arrived, they found a remarkably rich Christian architectural and religious tradition. In addition, Basil II, as all Byzantine emperors, commanded a really impressive professional bureaucracy and army. And this is a point I need to stress, because when the Crusaders arrive, they're coming out of a very different political and administrative situation. They are dealing with a situation where power has been localized, the so-called feudal system we'll discuss, whereas the Byzantine Empire retained the professional institutions of Rome. And that is a point I can't stress enough. This gave the emperor the power to tax his subjects. This gave the emperor the power to build a bureaucracy to administer his empire far more effectively than any Western European state. And some could even argue even far more effectively than the much larger Islamic empire. All that is a question under debate, but the Byzantine emperor could really get his revenues out of his subjects and impose his will probably more effectively than most monarchs in the Middle Ages. Greek, as I mentioned, was now the administrative language. The court was organized around the elaborate ceremony with numerous salaried officials, a whole hierarchy of special attendants on the emperor. Eunuchs were often designated as holding positions important. Eunuchs were preferred because they did not represent a threat. They had been mutilated. They acted as a shield to the emperor, so while the emperor might feed a discredited eunuch minister to the crowd, he himself was personally protected because they were often people of low origin or slaves who had been purchased from outside the empire. And this is a tradition that also went back to late Rome. All of these traditions struck the Western Europeans as very curious. And Anna Comnena, of whom I will speak quite frequently in this course, the Byzantine princess who wrote in the first half of the 12th century and gives us some of our most accurate descriptions of the Crusaders, constantly drops little hints and points along the way on how the Crusaders misunderstood the protocol, the ceremony, how they very often seem to react both with envy as well as some sort of uncertainty in dealing with the Byzantine court. In addition to the Byzantine bureaucracy, there was also a very impressive army, although after Basil's death, that army declined quite rapidly. The Byzantine emperors, again, because they had access to their subjects, to the taxation, to a bureaucratic class, could maintain a professional army. This army has been subject to a great deal of debate in recent years, and not the least of it in part fueled by Western European perceptions during the Crusades. And I'll read a passage of Western Europeans' attitude of the Byzantine army later in this course. But put quite simply, the emperor had in effect two forces. He had a field army stationed in the city of Constantinople, often known as the schools, the scholii. These were late Roman regiments going back in some instances to the 4th and 5th century AD. The Byzantine army had a tradition stretching all the back to the Roman period. In many instances, these units could point to their origins under the Emperor Constantine or some other emperor. And this was extremely important. They had a sense of unit integrity, a sense of professionalism. They were subject to corruption, purchase of command, and all the like, as any military on occasion. In Basil's case, these forces were drilled to a ruthless level of professionalism. Also, there were important elite bodyguards, foreigners who were taken into the imperial service and part of that field army. The most notable for Basil were the Varangians. These are the Scandinavians of Russia, mostly Swedes who had settled in Russia and came down the rivers of Russia, entered into imperial service, and reputedly Basil had 6,000 of these fellows. They fought in battle with the double axe. They were invincible infantry, and it is this infantry tradition that we'll see in Western Europe coming out of the Germanic tradition of fighting with axe and spear that Basil deployed. Besides the field forces in Constantinople, there were also what we would call provincial armies, the so-called themes. And these were armies that were quartered in different districts of the Byzantine world. Asia Minor was carved up into a series of new administrative districts in the 7th and 8th centuries, and the armies, in effect, were dispersed into the countryside. Soldiers were given land in return for imperial service. They showed up at regular intervals to be drilled. And one might think, well, how is this different from the medieval Western system of giving out a fief? Well, the difference is that in the Byzantine system, central authority was always there. The soldiers were given land. Very often they were land owners. They were given land to be worked, especially if they were cavalry. They were in effect an aristocratic elite, and they were under imperial officers. They were paid by the imperial government, so that the emperor never surrendered his power to not only to tax his subjects, but to tap into the military service of his soldiers. There were no intervening local levels here. That is, imperial officers commanded. They were responsible to the emperor. They could be removed from the emperor. To be sure, many of these officers were generally great magnates in their own right, but ultimately they were tied to Constantinople, the life of Constantinople, and so the army was controlled and kept under the hands of the emperor. Basil II, who is responsible for some extremely impressive imperial gains, especially in the Balkans, in Italy, and his immediate predecessors for gains against the Arabs in the East, developed a third component, field armies on the frontier. There was one in Italy, stationed at Bari, the Italian city of Bari today, another one at Antioch in northern Syria, one of the key objectives of the First Crusade, and then another one on the upper Euphrates, so that the Byzantine army at the time of Basil's death in 1025 was without question one of the most impressive military institutions around, and certainly by Western European standards, extremely impressive. There were a role for mercenaries. Byzantine emperors always hired mercenaries. Often mercenaries were then given land and assimilated into the regular Byzantine military structure. So a number of Western Europeans, starting in 1000 and going on through the whole period of the Crusades, actually served in these Byzantine armies and gained a great deal of important military technology. At the same time, now that's the sketch of what Basil's empire looked administratively, militarily. At the same time, Constantinople was also the New Jerusalem. And this is an important point to stress, and it also raises some of the problems that Byzantines and Crusaders had with each other. By the time of Basil's death in 1025, most Byzantines found the notion of recapturing Jerusalem, well, rather strange. To the Byzantine world, and this is a position that prelates and theologians of the law articulated, the new religious center of the Christian world was in the New Rome, Constantinople. Many of the most important relics had been translated to Constantinople. The most notable of them is the icon known as the Hotogetria, the depiction of the Virgin Mary and Child in which she's depicted in a very distinct form, and it reputedly was painted by St. Luke. We know in 626 that this icon was paraded around the walls of Constantinople to ward off an attacking force of Avars. And thereafter, Constantinople always saw herself as the Mary-protected, the God-protected city. Late Byzantine coins of the 13th century actually depict Mary over the city of Constantinople as the protectress. St. John, St. Luke, relics of them were also translated. Numerous saints, ascetics, and other figures going back to early Christian history ended up in Constantinople. And there was a constant outpouring of imperial money to rewrite the landscape of Constantinople into a new Christian city. Basil II, who wasn't quite as interested in church building, however, was the son and grandson of emperors who had been quite active in promoting that kind of construction. What went along with this notion that Constantinople was the new Jerusalem was also something of the Byzantine world of the view of the universe. Starting in the 6th century AD, there were efforts to reconcile classical geography with Christian theology. Now, that might sound like a stretch, but given the fascination with numbers, and especially when you remember Greek numbers are letters, so letters have values as numbers as well as magical values. You could see how some of this would come about. The most favorite of these, for me anyway, is a fellow by the name of Cosmos Indicopleustes, who wrote a topography, a Christian topography, in which he reordered the world as a rectangle. Well, he also had the Earth in the center of the universe, and earlier Greek classical opinion was divided on whether it's heliocentric or geocentric. So he had the Earth in the center of the universe, and the Earth was essentially in the form of a rectangle with Constantinople in the middle. And some of the notions of geography are really pretty chuckle-headed. Nonetheless, these types of notions of what the world looked like, that geographically Constantinople was the omphalos, that is the center of the world, the navel of the world, a term taken from the early Delphic oracle, were pretty widespread. And that's seen in both Byzantine imperial ceremonial as well as in Byzantine diplomatic arrangements. For instance, the seating of clergy from the whole of the Orthodox East was carefully regulated. How close was the bishopric to Constantinople? Envoys coming to the emperor were seated based on their religion, that is, Orthodox princes closer to the emperor, Western princes more distant. So they had a very, very powerful hierarchical sense of the world. And again, as I mentioned earlier, Anna Komnene captures some of this with the gruff Western European knights of the First Crusade, who come in and really are quite taken aback by this type of protocol. They're used to shaking hands. There's even one instance of an oafish Norman knight sitting in the emperor's throne because he got bored, and the Emperor Alexis just ignored him and eventually went away. But the hierarchy of the court was a way of focusing power. The Byzantine emperor could deal with envoys, with religious figures, through these traditions, impress, awe, and that was part of the secret of Byzantine success. Membership, as I mentioned, in the Orthodox faith was all important. In the time of Basil II, the Orthodox faith had been clearly defined. The Byzantines had gone through a veritable religious civil war called the Iconoclastic Controversy from 726 to 843. Perhaps one of the most important religious issues discussed in Christianity between the great councils of the 4th and 5th century and the Reformation. These disputes, there were a series of controversies in iconoclasm. These disputes led to the definition of the role of images. It led to the defining of the Orthodox liturgy. It influenced the construction of churches. Most churches were built for private worship. These would be the cross and square design. The icons, both fresco and mosaic, were carefully articulated so that no matter where you stood in the church, the story was very clear to you. There would be the Pantocrator above. You might see an Anastasis scene. There would be the doctors of the church, that is, the great theologians who defined orthodoxy with the resurrection scene above it. But all of this was worked out in the aftermath of the iconoclastic controversy and really promoted by Basil's forefathers and Basil himself. So when the Crusaders came to Constantinople, they encountered this full Orthodox tradition. And in that tradition were some unusual aspects of the Byzantine Orthodox Church that probably puzzled Crusaders. First, the Patriarch had enormous power. He had more central power and authority over his church than the contemporary Pope in Western Europe. And that is a point that is often missed by those who study medieval history. It's usually assumed that the Middle Ages was an age of faith, the Pope dominated Western Europe. We'll see that isn't quite the way it was. There are certainly papal claims to authority, but in many ways, the Patriarch in Constantinople was far more effective. And this might strike you as odd for a moment, because often it's thought, well, you know, if the Patriarch and the Emperor are in the same city, obviously the Emperor is the more important and the Patriarch is just the chaplain of the Emperor. Far from it. For one, the Patriarch presided over a central imperial church. Appointments to the great monasteries, to the bishoprics, all went through him. Now, he might consult with the emperor, and there are times when the emperor would interfere with papal elections or the patriarchal elections or the consecration of a bishop. But on the whole, there was only so much the emperor could do on that. And very often they would be in agreement on these issues of who would be appointed. This also meant that the bishops, archbishops, the great abbots of the Byzantine world spent a good deal of their time in Constantinople, angling for advantages, angling for translation, that is a move to a more lucrative see. You didn't want to be bishop of Caesarea. If you could be bishop of Ephesus, you'd get closer to Constantinople. There's that kind of intrigue going on. And in addition, the Patriarch had at his disposal a number of powerful monasteries in the city of Constantinople, including the monastery of St. Theodore of the Studion. And if the emperor ever really gave him any trouble over religious matters, he could simply put the word out and 10,000 monks would take to the street, rioting. And believe me, the Patriarch, when he wished, could start a riot very easily. That's done in 1054. In the period of the Great Schism, the issue of the Great Schism, the Patriarch simply orchestrates a riot to discredit the Western Europeans. Now, the Patriarch also, as well as the Emperor, felt that they had some kind of spiritual authority for the wider Orthodox world. If the Byzantine Empire was more than just its political boundaries, so was the spiritual world of Byzantine Orthodoxy. The Patriarch of Jerusalem, the Patriarch of Alexandria in Egypt, the Patriarch of Antioch in Syria, which for most of the period was under Muslim rule, the last, and only recently put back under Byzantine rule, all three of those patriarchates were seen as symbolically linked to Constantinople. The various Eastern Orthodox populations, as well as Monophysites, Nestorians, all sorts of other Christian confessions living under Muslim rule, were seen as somehow under the spiritual authority and protection of the emperor in Constantinople and under the spiritual guidance of the Patriarch in Constantinople. This is seen very often in the iconography. Even in such a late a church as the Church of the Savior in Korah, if you look at all the saints, they're the saints that come from the whole Orthodox world. Saints from Persia, from Egypt, from Dalmatia, today Yugoslavia, well beyond the frontiers of the Byzantine Empire. And there was a sense of a wider Eastern Orthodox commonwealth, which was very real to the Byzantines. So the Byzantine emperor was certainly concerned about Jerusalem. Byzantine emperors actually donated a great deal of money to the reconstruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Basil II was the first to do so in 1001. Several of his successors greatly extended the size of that church. But on the whole, they had no need to conquer and occupy Jerusalem because everyone knew Constantinople was the New Jerusalem. This gets me to another important point. Well, if this is the case, if the Patriarch held such a prominent role in Constantinople, what was his relationship to the Pope? And this is an issue that's going to keep reoccurring throughout the period of the Crusades. The Emperor, Alexis I, issued an appeal for military aid. And the primary person he went to in Western Europe was the Pope. And there's going to be reasons for that, not to all the kings of Europe. Well, popes and patriarchs had a dispute going back well into the late Roman period. And popes always insisted that they were the foremost patrine see. In the great councils of the 4th century, this was upheld at several occasions, at Constantinople in 381, at Chalcedon in 451. However, the Patriarch in Constantinople argued that by being Bishop of the New Rome, he was on equality with the Pope. He was, in Greek, autokephalia, that is, autonomous head. And there were other points of dispute between Pope and Patriarch. One would be, what happens in the event of an issue of doctrine? How is it solved? Well, by the time of the 11th and 12th century, it was very clear in the West that the Pope could speak on doctrine as the successor of Peter. But in the Patriarch's world, this could only be solved by an ecumenical council, where bishops from the entire Christian world come, and based on the authority of early Christian writers, would come to their decision. And this distinction, this is often known as conciliarism, that is the council, concilium in Latin. This tradition actually is still in Western European tradition as late as the early 15th century. But it never has a chance to make itself felt in the Western Church. And so this led to constant misunderstandings. Emperors actually helped confuse the matter. Byzantine emperors were usually in contact with Rome. It's a fairly easy sail to get from Constantinople to Rome during sailing season. And very often the emperors would play the Patriarch and Pope off each other. There were a number of these instances when the emperor, for instance, wanted a fourth marriage. The Emperor Leo VI. The Orthodox Church only allowed 3 marriages. Leo had the misfortune that his wives kept dying on him, and he still needed an heir. The Patriarch said, no, 3 strikes and you're out. Leo appeals to the Pope Sergius. Sergius says, no problem, we allow 4. And then immediately there's a dispute, and the Patriarch and Pope get into an argument over the question of the dispensation. There were other issues that came up from an early date. There was a dispute over the so-called filioque that had been inserted into the Nicene faith by the popes, that is, from the Son. That is, the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Son. That was not in the original wording. It was added in the Western Church to help with the Arian Visigoths. The Patriarchs insisted you needed a council to do this. The Pope said, no, my approval was sufficient. And again, these disputes would appear periodically. The most important of them will be the Schism of 1054, the Great Schism, where Patriarch and Pope will excommunicate each other. But the important point to stress is that at the time of the Crusades, the 2 Christian worlds had moved off in somewhat different directions. In its liturgy, in its arts, in its notion of religious authority, they did differ. There were tensions between Patriarch and Pope, culminating in the Great Schism of 1054. However, for the majority of Christians, most of these issues were not very important. Until the time of the Crusades, the contact between Western Europeans and Byzantines was relatively limited. It might be pilgrims coming through, it might be mercenaries, it might be merchants. The Crusades will change this. The Crusades will bring large numbers of Western Europeans into the contact of the Byzantines, and then Byzantine Christian and Crusaders will have a real sense of where they differ. Now, that'll take about 150 years for those changes and animosities and clashes to result in the sack of 1204 and other such matters. Finally, a few words I'd like to say is Constantinople also functioned as the new Athens. It saw a great cultural revival in the 9th and 10th centuries of its classical traditions. Basil II's family was very much responsible for the copying down of the classics. This all started with the polymath Photius in the 9th century, the editing of texts of Plato. As I mentioned, our best account of the people in the Crusades, maybe not the definitive history of the Crusades, but of the people, is the Princess Anna Comnena, who actually saw and met many of the participants, and who wrote her history in the 1140s after she was eased out of power by her brother. Anna is also in the well-known Greek tradition of historians write history because they can't do politics. She's just like Thucydides. He was the Athenian historian who was banished for military incompetence and goes out and writes a military history of the Peloponnesian War, typical of most historians. But Anna's account gives us real insight to these personalities. And the result is that Byzantine society as heir to this tradition, this classical tradition. Its aesthetics, its mores, its texts. The upper classes were very literate, men and women both. They had a fine sense of their continuity from the classical past, and really must have looked upon Western Europeans as quite crude and boorish. Western Europeans often return the compliment with thinking that the Byzantines were effete, too polished for their own good, and this would contribute a great deal to misunderstanding between the two sets of Christians. And I can only close with a good idea, one small example, perhaps trivial, of what these differences really meant. And the one that always fascinates me is that the Empress Theophano in the 10th century, a Byzantine empress, was married to the Holy Roman Emperor Otto II, and she's the mother of the Holy Roman Emperor Otto III. And when she arrived in Goslar, in the German capital, the Germans were absolutely excited with derision about her effeminate, polished ways. And 2 points in particular they made is that Theophano ate her food with a fork and bathed once a day. And these are perhaps the types of differences that in time would be stressed between the literate Byzantine society and the Western Europeans that would lead to a lot of the misunderstanding of the Crusades.